Net zero.
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 Net zero madness.
You are being lied to about net zero, one of the biggest, most expensive ideas in human history. You are being lied to by politicians who are misrepresenting the facts while accepting huge money from private business. You are being lied to so rich men can get even richer. Let's talk about how. Net zero refers to the idea of emitting no more carbon into the Earth's atmosphere than is removed by other processes. So it doesn't mean not emitting anything, but rather bringing carbon emissions down to as low as possible and then offsetting any remainder, either through natural processes like restoring wetlands or planting trees, or through technological fixes like carbon capture and storage.
We have to clean up the electricity system, stop burning fossil fuels to generate electricity, replace that with clean power. We have to massively expand the electricity system, and that's because as part of getting to net zero, we're going to have to electrify a lot of energy end uses. We'll be driving electric vehicles, electric buses, even electric trucks. We have to electrify the way we heat our buildings, particularly homes, and places like Northern Europe, most homes are heated with fossil fuels, with gas boilers. That's going to have to change. We have to electrify large parts of industry, whether it's like the Port Talbot steelworks, where they're replacing a blast furnace that burned coal with an electric arc furnace. And then there's a bunch of really hard stuff that we're going to have to address, like aviation. But aviation's hard because the energy density of oil basically is really hard to beat. There's huge kind of challenges, massive investment requirements.
The total spend required to get us to net zero is so large and so widespread that it's difficult to estimate. The United Nations Environment Programme estimates that around $9.1 trillion of investment is needed per year between now and 2035, and that's not reaching net zero in 2035. It's for this reason that people around the world are questioning the cost. Here in the UK, while the Labour government is doubling down on its net zero mission, the Conservative Party is increasingly moving away from net zero commitments, while Reform UK is explicitly campaigning against net zero. With the cost of living, and in particular energy bills, at an all-time high, it is entirely reasonable to question whether the UK government should spend billions of pounds on a high-level concept, especially when the UK contributes less than 1% of all carbon emissions. And fact-driven debate should be the bedrock of how we conduct civil society, here in the UK and around the world. Which is why it is so disturbing that politicians are straight up lying to you.
There is absolutely a playbook that people are using to try and put people off net zero, to try and make it seem really hard, really expensive, really difficult, or even impossible.
Let's go through the playbook in 5 steps.
The first step that often comes in this playbook is to make the cost of net zero or an individual solution, whether that's EVs or heat pumps, seem as expensive as you possibly can.
A classic technique is using out-of-date numbers. Because the cost of green solutions like EVs and solar panels and batteries have plummeted over the past couple of decades, older studies of the cost of net zero tend to be much higher than more recent numbers. Here in the UK, we are lucky to have the Independent Climate Change Committee, who have published 7 reports on the expected cost of getting the UK to net zero.
What's really interesting about the latest numbers from the Climate Change Committee is they're a lot lower than they used to be. People might remember that, and it's been thrown a lot, these sort of big, scary sounding numbers. It's going to cost like more than £1 trillion to get to net zero for the UK. That was the old number from the Climate Change Committee a few years ago. They said 1.3 trillion in investments, but that's all gone. That's out of date. The cost of clean energy technologies has fallen sufficiently that they now think that it's actually like 700 billion of investments.
The cost of net zero to the taxpayer, figures produced by the Institute of Government, are estimated between 2025 and 2030 to cost £45 billion every single year.
Here, Farage seems to be referencing this document from the Institute for Government, which is actually quoting the Climate Change Committee's previous report. And incidentally, in that report, the committee very clearly say that the majority of new investment can and should come from the private sector. So the government isn't going to be spending tens of billions of pounds extra per year on net zero. The private sector is instead. The government will be spending a few billion extra per year.
Because of the brilliant work that we the whole industry, have already done,
it's now got significantly cheaper. And here's some even better news. The public sector actually has to put in significantly less than we did in the first phase. The figures are roughly that the private sector will fund around 22 billion per year into the new energy system, and the public sector 4 billion. I mean, that seems a pretty damn good ratio to me.
Now, £4 billion a year is still a lot of money, but...
So the second step often is to pretend that we can just carry on with business as usual and it won't cost us anything. Let's say we're talking about decarbonising transport, and then people say, oh, but you know, an EV, that's going to cost like £40,000, you know, that's a huge investment. That's expensive, right? You know, and you add that up over all of the cars in the country and you suddenly get a big scary number again. Let's say we just carry on with petrol cars. Petrol cars aren't free, right? Okay, maybe you own a petrol car now, so you don't have to buy a new one, but that won't last forever. So that's step two, is you basically pretend that the existing system, which we've already built and paid for, can just carry on forever and won't ever need replacing.
Another example of this is in electricity production. Here in the UK, we get about 15% of our electricity from nuclear power, but our nuclear fleet is aging. The majority of reactors are set to be decommissioned by the end of the decade. To keep the lights on, those plants have got to be replaced. So talking about how expensive new wind and solar projects are, without mentioning the alternative, which is how expensive gas-fired power plants are, is, well, disingenuous, and it makes those wind and solar projects look much more expensive. And further...
Step three is you just pretend there aren't any operational savings from investing in clean energy solutions. For a gas-fired power station, you have to buy gas every year to keep it running, right? And that's the major cost of doing so. For a wind and solar plant, like, you have this upfront investment cost. Once you built it, there's no fuel costs. So if you just pretend that that saving of not having fuel costs doesn't exist, then obviously it makes it seem more expensive to get to net zero.
To return to the numbers from the Climate Change Committee's most recent report, they estimate that over 25 years, the UK needs to invest £700 billion into net zero. And over those 25 years, the UK will experience £600 billion of operational savings, meaning that the net cost of net zero is actually £100 billion spread over 25 years, so £4 billion per year. For reference, that's 0.1% of the UK's GDP. This is also actually mentioned in the previous report that Farage was citing. They quite clearly say that net zero might actually pay for itself by the early 2040s. Strange that he omitted that.
Classic number 4 in this playbook is just to ignore the co-benefits. What I mean by that, say we replace all our petrol cars, which, you know, obviously have exhaust emissions. You know, you walk down the street and it's stinky, right? That's air pollution. If you replace all of your cars with electric cars, you get rid of that. That brings enormous health benefits, just in terms of quality of life, but also in terms of, you know, less people suffering from asthma and so on.
Perhaps the most reputable numbers on this come from The Lancet, who publish an annual report on the impact of climate change on human health. They estimate that 2 million deaths a year are influenced by burning fossil fuels through air pollution. Though, because rich countries have started moving away from burning fossil fuels, and especially coal, that number has actually already come down by maybe 250,000 deaths per year. But aside from the health impacts, electrifying systems makes them much more energy efficient. I've made a whole video about that. And once you have built out a grid based on renewables, you are not dependent on other countries for fuel, as we currently are. See excellent reporting by Simon on this. Energy security and health are massive reasons to invest in renewables, but they're not the big one.
Basically pretending that there is no cost to not zero. Just say, oh, come on guys, let's just pretend this isn't a problem. Even though we know we're seeing already now escalating costs of extreme weather events, whether it's heat waves, floods. Specifically, you know, like the Office for Budget Responsibility in the UK recently said unchecked global warming would basically shave 8% off UK GDP by the sort of second half of the century. The costs of inaction are much, much bigger than the costs of getting to net zero. And actually that might even be an underestimate. Some sort of Institute of Actuaries that recently put out a report saying actually global GDP could halve, like 50% off, not in a good way, if we don't do anything about climate change. So yeah, sure, you can pretend that's not going to happen, but then you're basically just you're lining up much bigger costs, and that's particularly true for countries in the global south, vulnerable populations around the world. But it's also true for places like the UK. Again, the OBR looked at this and they said it would add huge amounts to government debt. Basically, you would have less productive workers, less tax revenue, less GDP growth.
We can't afford net zero. It's destroying the country.
So these are the 5 steps of the anti-net zero playbook. Inflate the costs, ignore the cost of business as usual, ignore the operational savings, ignore the co-benefits, and most egregiously, ignore the costs of inaction. Not getting to net zero is going to cost the world much more in the long run. Now this has been spelled out, it becomes so obvious to spot. These politicians are lying to you. But why?
Before I answer that, I just want to quickly mention that if you are watching this video in the first couple of weeks after upload, I am currently training to swim a half marathon to raise money for my local cancer hospice. This is going to hurt a lot. I made a whole video about why I'm doing this, which is linked below, along with my fundraiser page. Please do give that a watch, and if you can, please do donate.
Okay, let's get to the why. Generally speaking, it's not because these people deny the existence of climate change. The overwhelming majority of people around the world, and here in the UK, accept the overwhelming evidence that climate change is happening, and a serious problem. Instead, what we're increasingly hearing, including from Kemi Badenoch, the current head of the Conservatives, is that they are not climate skeptics, but they are net zero skeptics, which has some inconsistency.
This just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Literally the only way to stop climate change, whether you want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or 3 degrees, the only way to stop it getting hotter is to get to net zero emissions. That's it. That's just a fact of life. It's physics. You can't kind of argue with that. So if you're a net zero skeptic, you're basically saying, I don't want to stop it getting hotter.
I think there are 2 basic reasons for this disconnect. Firstly, as I've already mentioned, the UK represents less than 1% of all carbon emissions. China, the USA, and India all emit far more. And so British politicians will ask, why should we cut our emissions when China isn't doing anything?
Ignoring the fact that China's emissions have likely peaked and they're building twice as many renewables as the rest of the world combined.
This is a global problem. Everyone's emissions harm everyone else. But just because you're a small part of the problem doesn't mean you have no responsibility to be part of the solution. A global problem requires a global solution.
If every country that was like 1 or 2% of emissions said, well, we're only 1 or 2% emissions, so why bother? Then we obviously won't ever solve it. There's like a handful of massive emitters, China by far and away in terms of current emissions, the biggest. But then there's a lot of countries that are literally only like 0.5%, 1%. We can't solve it unless everyone does their bit.
And the UK has a special responsibility, being the country that started the coal-fired industrial revolution and set the world down a path ending in the climate crisis. This is a good book on the historical context.
But the second, much bigger reason is the link between politicians and the fossil fuel industry. There exists a 3-way relationship between the media, politicians, and the public. The media, such as newspapers, will report on topics that they see as being in the national interest, which is partly determined by who owns those papers, but also by the politicians of the day and what the public is talking about. Politicians will then read those papers and offer to the public policies that they think, based on what they have read, will get them votes. There's this complicated relationship that then emerges between all 3 parties. But 2 sides of this triangle are influenced by industry. And in this case, I mean the energy industry dominated by fossil fuel companies, who see net zero as an existential threat to their business model. And so, through financial incentives, will alter what politicians are offering to the public and what the media is talking about and how.
This can rapidly become a self-sustaining feedback as a nudge from industry changes what the media focus on, which changes what politicians talk about to the public, which changes what becomes the national conversation, which feeds back to what the media report on, and so on.
And in some countries, this influence is extremely clear and well documented.
The US, where there's huge amounts of corporate money go into political lobbying and funding campaigns, it's clear there's tens of millions of dollars went into the Trump campaign ahead of the election last year, and tens of millions of dollars went into his kind of post-inauguration fundraising. There is like a much clearer line that you can draw between some of that funding and some of that lobbying and actual things that they've implemented through that, the kind of one big beautiful bill, so-called. There's some of that stuff which is very clearly like fossil fuel industry asked for it, fossil fuel gave them money, and then the bill had those things, literally drafted by fossil fuel funded, think tanks and so on.
And this kind of influence isn't new. See our previous video on how the US government deliberately sabotaged climate talks in the 1980s.
While here in the UK, there is a definite link between right-wing politicians like Nigel Farage, Richard Tice and Kemi Badenoch and the fossil fuel industry. Reporting from DSMOG found that by mid-2024, the Reform Party had accepted £2.3 million in donations from the fossil fuel industry and climate skeptics, representing 92% of all donations to the party. And in entirely unrelated news, just this month, Reform published a bizarre letter online that seemingly threatened renewable energy companies with cancelled contracts should Reform win the next election.
And presumably also unrelated, last year Nigel Farage was present at the launch of the UK branch of the Heartland Institute, a right-wing think tank bankrolled by fossil fuel companies. Also in attendance were prominent members of the Conservative Party.
In the same reporting, which is linked down below, it's worth reading in full, since 2019, the Conservative Party was found to have accepted £8.4 million of donations from similar sources.
People like Neil Record, who's the chair of the UK's biggest climate skeptic lobby group, Net Zero Watch, he basically donated his house to run Kemi Badenoch's leadership campaign for the Conservative Party. She ran her campaign out of his house. I don't know, I can't speculate as to whether her kind of anti-net zero stance came because of that relationship with Neil Record, or whether because of her net zero stance he was like, okay, that's my kind of politician, I'm going to support her. I don't know which way around that is, but there's obviously some links there.
We cannot definitively say that the recent rise in anti-net zero rhetoric in the UK is explicitly because of the fossil fuel industry. But millions of pounds have flowed from that industry to right-wing politicians and political parties, and those parties have certainly ramped up their anti-net zero rhetoric. And it's not hard to see the link between a political party getting 92% of its donations from individuals and companies that would benefit from net zero being scrapped, and that party's economic policy being scrapping net zero.
A policy, by the way, that has been repeatedly described as complete fantasy.
These techniques are used over and over and over again to convince you of a lie, that net zero is ruinously expensive or even impossible. And that's not only incorrect, but it is dangerous to say that, because we know what the alternative to net zero is. It is climate breakdown. And we know why these lies are being spread. It's because of the people responsible for that climate breakdown. It's because of fossil fuel millionaires and billionaires seeking to become even richer by artificially extending the lifespan of their industry that we know is burning our future and already killing millions of people every year.
The next time you hear these lies, know who is really talking. It's big business. And they do not care about you. They care about their profits.
One thing that drives me absolutely potty is when I hear that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. That's what they tell us. That clearly is absolutely nuts.
A few weeks ago, I was asked a question by a patron, and I think it's worth giving my answer here as well. When I make a YouTube video, obviously I want people to watch it. And that's partly because when people watch it, Google puts adverts next to the video, and I get half of the ad revenue. Google keeps the other half. I financially benefit from views, as does Google, but not just from the ad money. Because as more people watch YouTube videos, the value of YouTube as a company increases. And so if YouTube were to sell in the future, it would go for more money, partly because of the work that people like me put in.
Yet despite being partially the reason for the company's value increasing, I won't see any benefit from that future hypothetical sale.
A fairer model would be creators getting some share of the revenue of the website that they upload their content to, as they currently do, but also getting some level of equity in that website, proportional to the amount that their work has increased the value of the website. And, to answer my patron's question, that is exactly how Nebula works.
Nebula is a streaming service owned and operated by over 100 creators across basically every genre. We upload our videos to Nebula before anywhere else, and there is a huge library of exclusive content that you can't watch anywhere else.
I have many exclusive videos on Nebula. This is one recent example about how the UK bans disposable vapes. But I'm just the tip of the iceberg. Frankly, I think it's worth getting a Nebula subscription just to watch Bobby Broccoli's 17 pages, or just watch Lindsay Ellis's amazing exclusive content. And these are just two of over 100 creators on the platform. And crucially, when I say that Nebula is owned by the creators, I mean that 50% of the equity of the company is split between all the creators that upload videos to the platform, proportional to the total watch time their videos have generated. Such that if Nebula were to be sold, and to be clear, that isn't under discussion right now, the creators, like me, would get a share of that sale price, because the work that we did increased the value of the company. And to me, that just seems like a fair way of doing things. If it seems fair to you too, and you would like to watch exclusive content from some of your favourite, or soon-to-be favourite creators, as well as transforming the creator economy, then you can get a Nebula subscription at go.nebula.tv/Simon Clark. And in fact, if you go there and get an annual plan, you'll also get a 40% discount. So that works out to $3 a month. That's go.nebula.tv/Simon Clark. Thank you so much for watching, and a special thank you to Dr. Simon Evans from Carbon Brief for chatting to me. If you're not aware, Carbon Brief is the #1 place on the internet to get your news about climate change. They do incredible work. Sign up to their newsletters to stay on top of the biggest news story in the world.
And of course, a very special thank you to my patrons, without whom I simply could not make these videos. Patrons get early access to videos, exclusive content every month, and at higher tiers can vote on topics for me to make videos about. Please consider signing up at the link in the description. And an extra special thank you to Alexandra Provost, Charlie Bruce, and Daniel Rafferty.
If you'd like to watch something else from me, then here's 2 videos I prepared earlier that I mentioned previously. And that just leaves me to say thank you again for watching. I'll see you in the next one.